all the data that's being collected about us, whether we're talking about the context of games, whether we're talking about the kind of articles you read, the kind of things that you post on social media. These are all being gathered in their sort of pattern, increasingly perfect record of our private lives. And as you mentioned, this record becomes permanent as the advance of technology allows them to store cheap a greater and greater body of data. Now, in the context of games, that can be your genre interests, what kind of games you play. It can be the kind of actions that you take in games. A quite common mechanic today is you get little trophies for in-game activities that you've done. So this is within a particular, a big body of choices. Games are often classically defined as simply a series of interesting choices. One player might choose to do this, another player may choose to do that. And whichever one you do, choice A or choice B, on your account that your friends can view, that the game's network can certainly view, often the game developer can view, you'll get this little digital trophy. It's just like a little picture, a little flag that says that this player did this. And so it's supposed to create allegedly this kind of social element, the sense of pride. You look back at all the things you did in all of these different games, but what happens when that's not private? What happens when it's not being used just for fun, just as a little personal trophy? But people who have access to this data begin to use that to correlate it with choices of interest. Not only what game did you play, how did you play that game, particularly when we're talking about games. It's very popular today for there to be moral choices in this. They try to present you with like the trolley problem. You can save this person or you can save this person, but you can't save them both. And there are sort of evil ways to play the games. There are good ways to play the games. Interestingly, we see people widely when we talk on a social scale, much more frequently tend to play the good route. What we're seeing is a whole new way to analyze people's choices, to define them beyond just what they look for, what they buy, what they read, but what they choose to do, often when they do, that anyone is watching, when they think it's just a game. Nothing matters, right? Because this is a digital world, no matter how villainous or how good you are, it all disappears. It's a sandbox, it's a playpen. But what if the choices that you made are being used to judge you in the most benign ways? Suggest a different game, you like this game, maybe you'll play another game like this for you to buy, or it could be something much more complex. And I think we're likely to see this happening on an increasingly more sophisticated basis as time moves forward.
But how is this information about your behavior or the way you play, how dangerous is it? I mean, how should we react? Should we be concerned about that? I mean, most people are saying, well, I have nothing to hide, whether I'm surveilled or not, this is me. And what do you respond to people who say that?
Well, saying that you don't care about privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about freedom of speech because you have nothing to say. What you're trying to do is, or what you are doing, is reordering who bears the burden in society. In a free society, you don't have to justify your rights. If you do, it's not right. Instead, society has to justify its infringement upon you. So instead of the government having to demonstrate, for example, why it would need access to this information, going to a court, showing probable cause for seeking a warrant to do some kind of investigation, they create social pressures to basically abrade the protections that we inherited. And now go, instead of them having to go through the court, perform all this investigative burden, the judge to establish that this is fair, and then do all this, they go, well, it would be easier if you just tell us this, because if you don't tell us this, isn't that strange? Isn't that suspicious? Why wouldn't you do this, right? And what is the value of these rights in the first place? Now, the right to privacy is the foundation of all rights. It's from which every individual and collective right derives. When you think about freedom of speech, it doesn't mean anything if you don't have that space in which to develop your own original thoughts, to figure out what it is that you think and believe, and to share that privately, carefully, with people that you trust, that won't harm you. Mistake, you say something stupid, you say something offensive. And having tested that, introduced it out to a larger and larger group until you're confident enough in it that you are willing to be judged for it. If you think about the ownings, private property, have that word private built into language. To own anything, so from an idea to the possibility to think to a place to lay your head, without privacy, you are owned by society rather than by yourself. Even when we look at things like due process, the right to a trial, these recognize that we inherently have a right to self that must be overcome by society. When we lose that, something very great indeed. And just to circle back to the question, should we be concerned about this type of data collection, whether we're talking about games, whether again we're talking about our online habits, whether we're talking about our pseudo online habits like social media, right? Where people go, oh, you're posting it out there in the world. But for most people, they're not really posting it for the world. They're posting it for their family, posting it for their friends, the people who actively follow them. Most people don't have 10 million followers, right? It can't seem to be seen as a truly public statement if we are not presuming a truly public scale. But it is, and it happens in the ways that we least expect and often in the least favorable contexts. Whether we're talking about small scale manipulations by these actors who have access to this data, what is really happening is power is being redistributed away from the individual, away from the uninstitutional community. This is group and community level individuals, right? Together as a population, as a class, but they are not the institutional interests of a capitalist society. Whether we're talking about civil society here, where it's NGO groups that are trying to influence policy this way or the other, often with good intentions, right? Or truly self-interested commercial organizations, or even governmental organizations, what we see is that if you are not an institutional power, you have very little visibility into this kind of information, even about yourself, certainly about others, certainly about what the government is doing, certainly about what these companies are doing. They have lawyers, they have public relations specialists, they have advertising and branding. You get an image of them, but you do not get the facts of their activities beyond what they represent them to be. Now, on the other side of that, these institutions, even something as simple as a games company, gets you to install Candy Crush on your phone, right? These are reporting metrics about your interests, about what apps are installed, all of these different things, categories of behavior that are happening on your phone. They're being reported through software development analytic frameworks, right? These are little tools that games developers just put into their game because it provides them added value. One, through monetization networks, share information about your activities, your habits, where you're at, what you're doing, your interests as far as the permissions on your phone permit. They gather everything they can, basically, and then they sell it and resell it to data brokers. They don't care about you as the individual, but they care about individuals at scale. And the more information they know about any given individual, this person's interested in this kind of shoe, this kind of app, this kind of TV show, this kind of person that's within their social network, your contacts lists, and so on. They begin to hold a map of many human lives. And then they can begin to parts of this map that they like or they don't like to get them to behave they would prefer. So we are basically being pushed into a world where we ourselves are forced to live electronically naked. At the same time, our rules, our betters in these institutional classes, are themselves cloaked from us. There is privacy for power, but exposure for powerless.
Listening to you, many of us feel slightly helpless. In your book, you're talking about this brief and beautiful time when the internet was mostly made of, by, and for the people. You're raising awareness. You're talking about this mass surveillance, that it's a never-ending census. Isn't it too late? It's already happening. People are already surveyed. What would you say to people who, what can we do about all this?
This is the reflexive response to seeing negative events in the world. We see this happening with social justice movements, with racial justice movements, particularly in the context of police violence. where it's very much the same dynamics. The smallest and the most vulnerable members of society are held to the highest standard of accountability. You break the smallest and you face the most ruthlessly enforced system of justice. At the same time, if you're a titan of industry, if you are a national scale politician with deep connections, you face a very different kind of justice, even for the most serious scandals. We see this at the level of the presidency in the United States. We have seen this for decades, again, in corporate behavior, not just as personified in the individual corporate executive, but also for the corporations themselves. We see it for banks, right? They're involved in money laundering on a historic scale, and they pay a tiny slap on the wrist fine. So what does this mean, as you say, and what do we do about it? Well, just as games teach players to become more sophisticated over time, they teach you the rules of the game through an increasingly difficult series of challenges, right? For example, famously in Super Mario's the NES era, you start the very first screen, you're on the far left, and Mario's only abilities in that game are to move and to jump. That's it, without any power-ups or whatever. And there's a very, very, very slow side of the screen that is walking towards you, very slowly, very easy to avoid. But it's saying if you don't do anything, as the frog, you are going to be boiled. As you move forward in the game, the challenges become more intense, greater, and your level of skill expression is expected to be higher. What's interesting about the game society was created for all of us playing it in the world today is we are punished largely for resisting the system as it is. And we are not rewarded for success in challenging the system. Rather, things like being driven into exile or imprisonment are the responses for that. In the United States, something that I never would have thought as a child, when I was watching TV shows where whenever a teacher did something a kid didn't like, they would respond, it's a free country, isn't it? Is to see the emblematic expression of police in every city, in every state. The first things you hear them say in any interaction that's played on the news or reported on the street today is stop resisting. What does it mean when we teach a world, when we teach a population at scale to stop resisting, when we try to create an impression that you will be rewarded if you stop resisting, and that you will face consequences if you do resist? Well, precisely what you expressed right there, the sense that there's nothing that anyone can do, that it's already happened, that it's too late. But the reality is it's not. We can begin resisting anytime. And the system as it exists today can change at any moment, particularly when we're talking about small ball stakes, like the fact that we're being phones, games, right, that we're reading articles with. There is a principle today called the third party doctrine. It's much more complex than this. But the idea is that once a company gains records about you by hook or by crook, they're no longer your records. They're the company's records. They're the company's property, even though the details of these records are about you, or some other person. And so the company then can use their property however they like. They can sell it, they can resell it, they can share it, they can do whatever. And if there's any claim against them, these companies hold up this magic talisman for them in the system, the terms of service, the EULA, or the end user licensing agreement. And they say, well, you agreed to this. Did we? We are all today presented this click OK to continue prompt, multiple points. Right? You go to a website and it's like, cooking, whatever. You have to click OK, or the video won't play, the web page won't load. You buy a brand new phone before you can use the phone. It says you have to agree to these terms of service, and they hide it with all these permission prompts. It's like, do you want your location services to be turned on? Do you want to share activities from your phone with Google? And everybody's like, no, 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 no. But then you click OK, and effectively, legally, you have consented to a much greater assignment of rights to these companies. But the reality is there's no way to sort of click not OK and continue. Because if there were that option, everyone would do it. No one wants to agree to these exploitative systems. And yet we are not afforded a choice. The illusion of consent, The illusion of our agreement with these systems is being used to replace the fact of our consent, a meaningful consent to these agreements. These are unequal agreements from which we can't escape, right? But again, does it have to be that way? Well, think about every other industry where someone might have really personal, very private information, your activities, right? When we talk about your therapist, a psychiatrist, when we talk about a health coach, when we talk about a doctor, who knows why you came in last time, what was wrong with you, what you needed help with, what kind of medications you were prescribed. When we talk about, for example, a financial advisor, your concerns, you're trying to plan for retirement or this, that, or the other. These people have what is called a fiduciary interest to you. They are forbidden, sometimes in many countries by law, other times through professional organizations, from using this information to benefit themselves or any other person to your detriment. So why is it that in the case of the internet and all the businesses that are connected to it, we make an exception? We say it's not okay for your doctor, who comparatively knows very, very little about you, to share this information, but it is okay for Google, who saw you purchase your medications, who saw you searching for the details of your condition and everything else, to do whatever they want with this information. Why is it okay for Mark Zuckerberg to exploit you in every conceivable way, and not just you, your entire family and everyone else on your social graph that you're connected to, right down to how far you toss a pigeon in Angry Birds? But it's not okay, for a lawyer that you had contact with for one time about a disagreement about where a fence lies on the property line. Which one of these things actually has more impact on our lives on the large scale? And why is it that we are applying greater regulations to the less impactful niches that traditionally were seen as more privacy impairing, when in reality, Google can do more damage to any one of us than the combination of all the professional organizations that you've dealt with in your entire life?
Edward Snowden, the focus has very much been on regulations. What you're saying right now is the focus should be on collecting data, basically. People should raise awareness about that.
I mean, look, it's very popular for regulators today, who, remember, are being lobbied with incredible financial backing by richest corporations in history, basically, not to regulate here. And when they must regulate, these industries are going, well, okay, if you have to regulate, here's a preferred form of regulation. Here's what won't harm innovation, whatever they call it today. And it's been very popular since then to go, okay, well, the problem is data protection, right? We've all heard about in Europe, they've got the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And all of these little legislative proposals that emulate, that are bubbling up in other countries. And the way they justify this is, data breaches and hacking. We've seen this, and it's become big stories in the news. And this implies that, well, it's okay if the company, so as long as they keep it safe. And the problem is when the company loses its hold on this information, somehow it spills in, some hacker gets it. But that's not really the threat. It's not the hacker that is causing problems at a society-wide scale. It is the companies that are causing the problems at a continuing scale, right? The hacker is a problem, yes, but they are far lower order problem than the behavior that actually needs to be targeted. So what's happening here is we're being told that we have a data protection problem. I'm here to tell you that we don't have a data protection problem. We have a data collection problem. If you stop the collection, there's very little that we need to protect. If the companies don't hold the information in the first place, they don't need to guard the information. There's nothing for the hacker to take, right? If we could reduce the sphere of information that has been effectively stolen from us by deception, we won't have this great vulnerability that now everyone's reading. So,
before we get to, we have one question from a viewer, just a very quick reaction about the President Biden just signed this executive order on this cyber attack. I just wanted to have your reaction on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, we recognize that, again, hackers and things like this are a problem. We do have an incredibly brittle global network. Why is that? It is precisely because policies that have been held out and expanded intentionally by national governments for the last 50 years. Governments, including particularly the United States government, have used their representation in standards-making bodies to do things like keep the cell phone networks insecure. They will make them use weak ciphers to protect our communications, right? This is a kind of encryption. We might talk more about it later. But the idea I mentioned earlier, electronically naked, our communications as they transit the internet, the types of software that we create, the level of quality that we require has always been low. And when the government, for example, discovers some vulnerability in national or global scale infrastructure, like they find a weakness in Microsoft programs or Apple programs, frequently they conceal this information and use the knowledge of that vulnerability to spy on other people around the world. This is called exploiting a vulnerability, right? This is hacking in the classic sense. If you discover a vulnerability in software that nobody else knows about, you can use that to break into every iPhone in the world, for example. Or anybody who visits a website where you can get in between the connection that's using a particular browser, for example, which is used in all the Android phones around the world. If you find a vulnerability in the way that those Android phones render a web page, right? They receive the data about it and then they, start filling in, this is a picture, this is a text, whatever. You can hijack the phone, effectively the execution operations on the phone, and you can do anything you want. And the government does do this. And the government has permitted a commercial industry around this. There's for-profit companies that do nothing today. Their entire business is to find critical vulnerabilities in most important programs and networks around the world, and then sell them. They sell them to governments around the world. And what skills do these people develop? Where are they being used when their only reward is for breakthroughs? Now, there is a desire for us around the world, of course, to have skills to find these vulnerabilities, because we want to discover these vulnerabilities and have them be closed. Because if they're not closed, again, anybody who finds this can let themselves into phones, let themselves into our laptops, let themselves into our gas networks, as happened in the United States. But the problem is, for too long, governments haven't been closing these holes. They have been setting up entire cottage industries that help them find these holes. And governments pay them money and they say, hey, here's a way to get into this phone, here's a way to get into this website, here's a way to get into whatever you want. And that's $1 million, right? It's actually more than that. But the idea is, what if, for the last 50 years, instead of rewarding businesses, rewarding government agencies for keeping our global network vulnerable, we have been rewarding them for making them more secure? What if we had been incentivizing people to close these vulnerabilities, to fix these vulnerabilities, instead of telling them, well, the best thing that you can do with this is sell this on a gray or black market? Now, as to the actual concerns of the order itself, the top line thing that I've noticed, and I haven't read this in full depth, is the fact that the US government seems to be ordering a restructuring of its contractual relationships with the companies and businesses that it has contracting for federal government services with. Who does the federal government contract with? Everybody that matters, right? We're talking about Apple, we're talking about Microsoft, we're talking about Google. Most importantly, and I think most quietly, we're talking about Amazon, particularly Amazon's web services. Amazon Web Services runs basically half the largest sites on the internet. Now, the government is saying they make it so that anybody who contracts with the government must have new contract clauses that require them to share information about what is happening in their networks, not only with defensive agencies of the federal government, like the FBI, which is only pseudo-defensive to begin with, but it explicitly says other intelligence agencies. So now we're going to have Microsoft, Amazon, everybody else explicitly sharing their network information with the intelligence agencies of the United States. And that is a very dangerous and inappropriate precedent to set.
I will definitely follow that. So we have a question, if we go back to the online gaming, we have a question from Luke Donahue from Liverpool. He's asking, it looks like the next frontier of gaming is going to be immersive technologies such as virtual augmented reality. What do you believe are the deeper privacy implications of having these devices strapped to our faces that not only constantly analyze the environment around us, but also analyze our emotional state through face and eye tracking sensors?
I mean, I think the question answers itself, right? When we look at the invasive properties of gaming and as they've progressed, originally we had the kid on the couch, right, wherever they were in my generation. And the most that could be known about them is credit card networks or whatever, or the Toys R Us or the Radio Shack or whatever, sees what card purchased what games. That was really the maximally invasive extent that the industry could reach for analytics, because there was no connection, there was no talkback coming from the devices on which they were played. There were no online surveys, there were no whatever. Then we moved to the same kinds of consoles, but they're remotely connected. Now your activities in the game can be sent back to the developer or whoever, or shared with groups like Facebook, because many people are mobile first gamers now. They're not playing on consoles, they're playing while they sit on the bus or in the back of a car. And they don't even realize their location is being tracked and other things by these games. But it is. Now you have a much greater corpus of information. However, these games were not able to do things like track your gaze. Eye tracking is a technology that's used in these new virtual reality headsets to perform something called foveated rendering. We're talking about creating a 3D environment that changes and is re-rendered as you look around and move your head. Obviously, the headset needs to be able to tell where you're looking, where you're turning your head, right? In order not to render the entire scene that you can't see because of the weaknesses of human peripheral vision, they just want to see where you're actually looking, the small part that your eye is hitting, and they'll draw that crisply, cleanly. There's a lot of effort to make that look good, and everything else that you don't see clearly, they'll do a lazier job on it, so the device will be more efficient. But think about now, can a developer or the manufacturer of the headset, which is Facebook, for one of the largest virtual reality headsets today, they can actually see in the game what you look at, how long you looked at it, what caught your attention, what caught your interest, not just the decisions you made, but increasingly as we get to more of this stuff, your level of excitation, response to. I think we should very much be concerned about that. We should certainly limit how this information can be collected and used. There's a very basic principle here that I think people, at least regulators, certainly miss. If a category of information is not absolutely necessary to collect in order to provide for the essential functions of their business, it should not be collected. And if it is being collected, there should be questions answered, and I think, and penalties assessed.
What is the fear? What is your fear about this?
I mean, I think I just described it in broad strokes. Really, it comes down to that question earlier, what can we do about this? Society is being engineered largely via technology. And this is both simply broadcast communications technology, both on the large public scale, you think cable programming, the way that propaganda works through these systems, but also in social media, where you can say different things to different categories of population, quiet voice here, loud voice there. We are seeing an engineering of opinion to provide for this redistribution of power, where people feel disempowered to change the system, so they do not resist the injustice of these systems wherever they encounter them. They feel as though they can do nothing about it. And as they begin to internalize the presumed truth of this state of affairs, technology quietly moves in to entrench that system and to detect anomalies, anomalous responses, anomalous behavior, anomalous individuals. These people are the minority. But the thing is, the minority is where progress arises from. Look throughout every sort of truly unjust history. You'll see something quite unusual, I think, to modern sensibility, which is the fact that the law, as it stood, was unjust, and resistance against the unjust law was the thing that was illegal. The legality of a thing is very different from the morality of the thing. And I think we are being taught daily through 1,000 stories exposed, 1,000 moments. There's headlines that the stories we don't even read, but we see the headline. We see the picture. We see the meme again, again, and again, and again. We see what happens in the game, the culture that reflects the stories that we tell. And we internalize these decisions into calculations. Let's say you will be punished for doing the right thing, and you will be rewarded for doing the wrong. And this technology develops a greater sense to discriminate the ones who are to be rewarded for their obedience and the ones who are to be punished for their desire for progress. Early intervention will create the possibility of China-style population management at scale.
How these technologies, these data, these record, this question from Lucas about face and eye tracking sensors, could it be harmful, and the way they're going to use it? How are they going to use that information? And in your view, can it be used to be harmful?
Yeah, we already see facial biometrics in general. There is this type of over the skin surveillance, right? Large scale physical surveillance, which we're all familiar with. In the general sense, you go into the gas station, there's a video camera, right? We've internalized, we've accepted it. It's in the state of play since 1970. But then there are other segments of it which we are peripherally aware of, but we don't necessarily expect it. For example, license plate readers. You're driving your car, and there's a camera on a pole somewhere. You might think it's a speed camera. Maybe it is a speed camera. Maybe it's both. But the idea is every car that passes by these cameras is not being photographed for, make and model alone, but make, model, and your license. And of course, your license plate can be tied back to your identity, access to these information. And when you think about these at scale, when you think about highway on-ramps and off-ramps, when you think about, shopping centers, when you think about all the watering holes at which human society is, you think, okay, now they can track human movements at scale through our means of conveyances, right? Our ways to transport ourselves bodily. Then you think about the fact that these cameras at the gas station now aren't just recording footage, but they're starting to do object recognition. They go, a car rolls. It's a car that's this make and model. This car with this make and model, even if the license plate isn't visible, could be correlated with this one that was that license plate. Person gets out of this car. They're wearing this clothing. They have this face. Have we seen this face? Who is this face associated? What payment method did this face use when it entered this store at a completely different shopping center across town or across the country? And these things accrete, they build on top of each other. And what you get is a deeper and more complex relationship between the person, the habit, means of payment, the method of transportation, the property records, the family records, the reading interests, until everything is known about you by everyone but who has any measure of power or resources in society. And you know nothing about them. And the funny thing is, they didn't have to lift a finger to do it because it happened through automated processes. And then what happens when we go beyond above the skin and we start under the skin? We talk about health metrics that are through your watch or whatever. Right now, maybe it's not transmitted off device, but increasingly we see that these things are other services that want you to provide this information because it allows them to improve their products or services, whatever sense they give. Or they say they anonymize these data sets before transmitting. Well, you can't anonymize human activity or human characteristics at scale. There have been studies done again and again that with an anonymous data point or data set, if you get something as small as like 2 or 3 different locations, you can basically or de-anonymize some anonymous data set. Think about, for example, if someone got all of your movements through life, and it was completely anonymous, they didn't have anything about them, anything about your personal information, but your phone stops for 8 hours a day, at least, or whatever, at your house. And it spends another significant period of time back in the before times at the office. And just with those points, people can already rule out, many, many orders of magnitude of humanity. And the potential people that this could be are only the ones who sleep every day in this house or this apartment or whatever. When we start to get people's emotion states, when we start to get a sense of their inner thinking, even if it's just through inference of their heart rate, their perspiration, their gait, their facial analysis to go, okay, we know this face. What's the emotional state of this face? Is it happy? Is it sad? It's watching a TV show about this. This politician is speaking, responding favorably, or are they responding unfavorably? These are not really complicated capabilities for technologies that exist today. We're talking the scale of engineering challenges rather than scientific challenges. And to me, that says we have a regulatory challenge. Because if that's a world that looks attractive to people, I don't know what to tell you. It's pretty obvious to me what those dangers are.
We have a question from William Gadouri. Edward Snowden, what value would a player's in-game moral choices and accomplishments have to a AAA game publishing company except from market research?
So I'm not sure I understood the question.
Okay, so
Yeah. Go ahead.
What would be good alternatives for gamers or consumers that are playing video games?
I mean, the idea here that, the ideal alternative is simply that this telemetry not be provided. A developer should not be presumed to know every player's every choice. If a player wants to opt in to sharing this information to help development or to personalize their experience, sure, they could have that choice. But the idea that these things happen by default, the idea that these things happen because a game engine, affords the capability for it, is, I think, generally quite wrong. When we think about the usefulness of these things as they're described, it's largely justified on the basis of either marketing research or what it's really tied to, which is development priorities. They go, well, we want to create a forking path in the game's narrative. You can choose to go into the woods or you can choose to go into the mountains. How many players choose to go in the woods? How many players choose to go in the mountains? Well, if it's tremendously lopsided, we know 90% of people want to go in the mountains, then we should put as many resources towards developing the experience of the woods. There's an argument. Does that justify the mass surveillance of the entire player base? I would say no. I'll leave it at that.
We have a lot of questions. Eric Lessa, how do you see Apple's position regarding tracking possibilities? Do you believe in some type of ethic data management to appear as a general practice in the future?
Yeah, so I think when we talk, this is getting to Apple's new AirTags devices that are out there, which are really just a privacy disaster. To their credit, Apple has tried to provide some vestigial warning that you're being tracked here, where like if the tracker follows you for 3 days, it'll start sounding an alarm. But you can squelch these, physically open the device, remove the speaker, close it, and then put it in something. And they go, well, your phone can detect this thing and your phone will send a warning. But if we're talking about things like intimate partner violence, where you spend the night with the person who might be secretly tracking you, and they might have access to your phone, they can go into your options and say, let's ignore this warning. More generally, I think that we should be asking the question, do we need a world with more tracking devices? Should corporate responsibility infer that these kind of capabilities are provided, where someone at Apple goes, every Apple phone has a little tracking phone most of the time. It's got a wireless radio unit that you use for Wi-Fi connections that is also capable of hearing Bluetooth. Has another radio that's capable of hearing cellular connections, right? So it knows where all the cell phone towers are around you. It also has the ability to hear GPS positioning satellites. And they go, we made a little Bluetooth beacon that any phone in the world would help others report. Even if that iPhone isn't like explicitly saying, do you want to help, narc on this token that you just walked past? Because Apple goes, oh, people, we're going to have billions of these devices out there. We want people saying yes, 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 yes all day, or no, 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 no. So let's just make them happily join. Let's just make them reporting this all the time. Now, the funny thing is, this is not like an extraordinary new technology. these capabilities already exist. This is used for providing location services. This is how phone knows where you are when you don't have a good GPS signal. They go, well, you're near this Wi-Fi access point, which is a Starbucks. You can also hear this Wi-Fi access point, which is a bank. And we know from previous GPS fixes from other people's phones that the place where you can hear both Starbucks and the bank has to be within this circle, right? That's, you know, however wide. So this person is present. With become open for our devices to be a mapping where everything, everyone within it is what their activities are. And for that to be like a big policy conversation, for that not to be a big anything, for that simply to be business as usual. Well, we see more and more corporations going in this way. They can act with full, I like to say, freedom from permission. This is the classical concept that we once called liberty, right? The ability to act without asking anyone if it's okay. And at the same time, for us, for the individual, for the people living in the society they have created, we have freedom from permission. In fact, more permissioning gates we are required to pass through on any given day. You have to click OK to continue. You have to, you know, send your CV. You have to send your photo. You have to send your passport to the bank. You know, you have to show it's this kind of credit card. It's this kind of proof of address. Our experience freedoms as individuals are becoming more limited. Rather, we are being judged as desirable consumers, as desirable accounts on social media platforms, desirable voices, desirable people. At the same time, no one is making judgments on a global scale about are these corporations and their activities desirable. And this is where people begin to get that sense of disempowerment from. They see that we have two-tiered systems of justice between the institutional or the institutionally connected and the individual. And I think that's where a lot of this trouble arises from.
You mentioned earlier that you know people can resist. People have the power to do something. Many people, many of my colleagues, many people actually agree to the fact that they don't want to be surveilled. They don't want companies to know about their private life. How do you resist, though? You said it's not enough just to criticize or to say I'm against it. What can people actually? How do you resist, in your view?
Well, there's many different ones. The first step is always to care, right? And when people say that they don't care, to judge them for it. Ask why. What does it mean if nobody cares? What does it mean if we not today in this moment? What happens tomorrow? What happens when we create a new norm where we all ignore a missing stair in society, a known flaw that people just walk around, they deal with because they know it's there. And what happens when someone who doesn't know about it is hurt by it? I think one of the most important things that we have lost within my lifetime is a sense of solidarity in movements, certainly a sense of representation by our politicians. If you look at many of the most advanced democracies in the world, and honestly, you look at many of the most authoritarian countries in the world, you'll see that they're all gravitating toward each other. If you think about political compass, graph, where we've got two axes, right? You've got the liberal and the conservative. That's where so much of our political conversation takes place. But no one really talks about the authoritarian and the libertarian axis. And what's happening is that companies or countries and companies, whether they hold liberal or conservative values, they're all sort of moving north toward more authoritarian policies. And this, I think, divorces them from the majority of populations, which themselves hold no influence or power. They have no ability to really assert their will scale, who have no authority and instead are merely subject to authority. And as a sort of natural response, we would at least infer they have a more libertarian positioning in this chart, even if we're not talking like libertarian south end of the chart, but we're merely talking more a centrist ideology for the totally apolitical person. No one wants the police to kick in their door and drag their children out and their journals and whatnot, certainly without cause. But what we need in a world where there is no political power without institutional representation is either institutional representation that is powerful enough to achieve reform, or the alternative, unfortunately, inevitable, is the system becomes unstable, and that leads to revolution. When we talk about the possibility of revolution in a modern day society, it's really a dark path. It's not anything that I think anyone wants to see, because the mechanisms for violence and its application are very much not in the hands of the public. And so when we talk about what we can do, when we're talking about the non-violent sense, we need to recognize that we have to share at least some subset of values that the institution can represent, that we can basically resource this institution to fight all these other guys. The problem is now we're talking about the non-governmental, non-profit, non-commercial institution against the richest institutions in society. And if this in any way gets people, a little bit pessimistic, a little bit concerned, I'm going, well, that doesn't seem very likely. The question that you should ask yourself is, why? Why does it seem unlikely? How did we arrive at that state of play? Who is responsible for it? And why is it that it would seem an unjust system is being intentionally stabilized through legislation, through regulation? Barriers to reform are being enacted. At the same time, the national slogan of sort of police forces is becoming "Stop resisting." That is a flag that a system very much does not want to be changed. And I think at that point, we really need to start asking difficult questions about mandate and talking about ways where, if the political process will not provide for change, do we have alternative means? And this does not mean violence. This can mean things like enforcing our rights through technology and science. Are there ways we can guarantee human rights? Are there ways we can enforce human rights, such as the right to privacy? Not merely through legislation, which we want, or regulations, which we want, but can we create devices, tools, and services that the average person can use without expertise, they don't even know it's there, that protect your communications? Encryption is the greatest example of this in my lifetime. It does not solve all privacy problems, but it solves a very large category of privacy problems. And you use encryption every day, whoever you are listening to this. And the vast majority of the times that you do use it, you don't even need to be aware it's happening invisibly.